Hello and welcome to Atheist Talk. My name is James Zimmerman and I'm going to be your host for this episode. Today we're going to be talking with Kim Socha. Welcome, Kim.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Kim is, she is the author of Women, Destruction, and the Avant-Garde, A Paradigm for Animal Liberation. Mm-hmm. You are also a contributing author. You had an essay in Atheist Voices of Minnesota a few years ago, and currently you're an English professor at Normandale. Mm-hmm. Did I get all that right?
That's all correct.
But today we are talking to Kim about her newest book, which is Animal Liberation and Atheism. I had to look at the title to make sure I said it right. But So why don't you tell us just briefly what the theme of this book is and why you felt the need to have it written?
Sure. I've been atheist for maybe about 15 years or so, and an animal rights activist for about 6 of those years. And what I wanted to do, what I had noticed in many of the core texts of animal liberation movement are written by atheists. And predominantly, the movement is made up of secular thinkers, often a-religious, meaning they just don't think about it, or sure. Atheist agnostics. But what I noticed was there were theological texts, so looking at Buddhism, like Buddhist perspectives or Christian perspectives, a lot of books on Christianity and animal rights or liberation. And I noticed, I thought to myself, if the majority of this movement, if the individuals are secularists, why is there no book taking an atheological position in a very direct way? So, for example, the classic work is Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, which he wrote in the mid-70s, and he's an atheist, and he argues that religion has been horrible for animals, hasn't helped them, but I wanted something much more deliberate, so that's why I came up with such a direct title, Animal Liberation and Atheism, in the same way that one would say animal liberation and fill in the blank with any religious perspective.
Sure, really tying them together more strongly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I didn't mention this a second ago, but the subtitle, Dismantling the Procrustean Bed.
Right.
I think you need to define one of those words
yes,
for our viewers.
Bed, right?
Yes, bed.
So because I had such a direct, in-your-face main title, I had to come up with more of a esoteric subtitle, because that's what academics do. And the Procrustean Bed is based on the myth of, the Greek myth of Procrustes, and he was a thief and a torturer and a killer who had an inn, actually by the entrance to Hades, and people traveling by, he would invite them in to stay, and he would make them fit into his bed. So if they were too tall, he would chop off their limbs. If they were too short, he would stretch them out, and then the people would die. And if someone ever fit the bed perfectly, he would just move them to another bed.
Oh, okay, that they didn't fit. Yeah.
Yes. So what that's come to mean, I mean, I certainly am not the first or only person to use that analogy. What it's come to mean is anytime you try to force conformity, or the simplest way is to think of putting the square peg in the round hole.
Sure, yeah.
Trying to make something fit, where if you do some investigation, it doesn't. It's a Procrustean bed.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Thanks for clarifying.
Sure.
So after reading the book, I have a few things that I think would be most interesting that we can talk about without giving everything away, and still inviting people to inviting people to read more. So maybe we can whet their appetite. So one of the first interesting things that you talked about, I think maybe it was even in the introduction, is something you called a gotcha questions. You said that there are atheist gotcha questions and vegan gotcha questions. Maybe you can start with the first set and tell us what those are.
The atheist, yeah. Basically, the questions are, people who are hostile or, maybe or even not just hostile. They feel that their views or ethics are being attacked. Mm-hmm. So they try to get you, with, if I put it this way, you won't, it's just going to blow your mind or something. So a lot of the atheist ones are, are you just angry at God? I think you're just mad at God. Yeah. I mean, the kind of circular reasoning, if God doesn't exist, how can you explain why we're here?
Yeah.
How can you
be good?
Yeah, how can you, so what would be people actually think that you have no moral or ethical code if there's nobody to be held accountable to.
Yeah.
So these, and I guess the biggest I gotcha is, I'm saying God says the world, I'm saying God created the world. So you're saying God, there is no God. well, explain to me how we exist. And I'm like, well, the world's greatest physicists, cosmologists can't explain it all yet. So that's a little too much pressure to put on me to explain.
And then you said, so essentially people are trying to like get you to like, as if you never thought about this before. To
exactly.
say, oh, I never thought about that. You're right. I am totally without a moral compass.
Okay, I suddenly believe in God.
Yeah, and I've now changed my mind. So you said that in your book, then you tie in there's equivalent in the vegan community too.
Yes. And then there's one I got you question that really ties them together. So the most common questions I hear are, what about you eat plants, and plants are living beings and they might be sentient, so therefore you just eat animals because who cares? You can't. Okay, another common one is, well, that's why animals are here, and that almost always goes back to biblical assumptions. And animals eat other animals. So if you think humans are animals, which I obviously do, why shouldn't we eat other animals? To which and protein, you can't, I've actually had people say to me you can't exist without animal products when they're talking to someone who obviously exists.
So you're a miracle then.
Yes, I'm like, am I a hologram?
So then after the introduction, the first main thing you talk about is how religions tie in with animal rights or don't tie in. And you mentioned, because obviously there are Christians and Buddhists who do, or at least feel they do, or do, believe in kindness toward animals, or who are vegan or vegetarian, yet their texts and their religious leaders, you say, kind of defy that worldview. So maybe I can let you talk about it instead of me.
Yeah, and what I kind of chalk that up to is applying secular or non-religious based ethics or ideas to a religion that you want to believe in. So one example I give where this happens in other contexts is Richard Dawkins has noted that in some Christian communities there's really progressive views on gay marriage and things of that nature, but when people express an acceptance, they're really applying secular thought to those religions. So then this question comes, well, if you have to do that, if there is this like divine ordinances, you shouldn't have to go in and switch it up a little bit. So I understand why this happens. And I don't want to downplay the important work that people do in the animal rights movement who are religious. But what winds up happening is if you present it that way and somebody is willing to do, especially with Christianity, just the tiniest bit of digging into what the Bible says, what church leaders say, the message is extremely clear. Animals exist for human purposes. The Bible says it. The Pope has said it, popes have all said it, and have not wavered from that perspective. It's permissible. It's not required, which is notable. No religion actually requires it, but it's permissible to use animals.
You mentioned an example in your own life when you were writing, was it your doctoral thesis? And you tried to point out that the text, the New Testament is not compatible with animal rights, and somebody, maybe you can... An
anonymous reader. Okay, so I had talked about a very classic scene, assuming you were raised Christian, where Jesus is in the temple in Jerusalem and people are engaging in commerce. So he upturns the tables and he gets, says, get the cattle out of here, set the birds free. And somebody had used that example because I was critical of Christianity in the book and said, well, no, Jesus was setting the animals free in that. So how can you counter that? And I was just really floored because I'm like, Jesus was not angry because animals were being caged. If anything, it's because the cattle, let's say the oxen were being sold for idolatrous sacrifice. So that would be a potential problem because they were trying to get away from these old traditions and sacrifice was no longer required. And in the same scene, Jesus also makes a whip out of cords and starts whipping the animals to get them out of there. So he's whipping animals, and someone either wanted to, or I think the word is had to, try to find some kind of value in that. Because, and as I put it in the book, when I do try to be somewhat sensitive, although I might come across as snarky at times. I feel like if I believed in a God very much, I thought this being was a part of my life, and I would want what I thought was ethical to match up with what my God thinks is ethical. So I see why there's this need, but I think it doesn't take really much critical thinking at all to read a passage such as that or others and see that this is not an animal-friendly religion.
So Buddhism and Hinduism, then, they're animal-friendly, right?
Yes, more so, but as I put it, better doesn't mean good enough. And I talk about, they're often seen as a wonderful alternative, and some of them are atheistic, and this is, not everybody would agree, but most people are. I've actually studied Buddhism since becoming an atheist, and some branches do not believe in a God.
Yeah, we interviewed a Buddhist atheist on the show.
Oh, good.
Once,
Yeah, that's very
Mm-hmm.
common.
So I know what you mean. Yeah.
But there is no, across the board, there are no forms of Buddhism or Hinduism that require, well, strict veganism. Sometimes there's vegetarian, you know, but the reason is not necessarily, or even at all, because the animals' lives have their own unique values separate from what they can do for humans. It is always about the ascension of the human animal. So whether it's being reborn into a higher plane of existence or reaching nirvana, one of the most animal-friendly Buddhist texts I read, which actually acknowledges that animals feel terror and pain, eventually says, but don't eat them, because if you do, you may fall into the womb of one of those animals, one of those flesh-devouring animals, and you'll experience a lower birth.
Oh, okay. Makes sense. Yeah.
So it's just about, it's always human-centric.
Sure. Yeah, so like, don't eat this animal because you might not make it to a higher form of existence, not because they're suffering.
Yes, so it's not necessary, which isn't to say there isn't compassion, because there is a sense in Buddhism, like, again, acknowledging that animals do experience tension and terror at those moments, and you ingest that, and that could make you become a violent person. But it's always about the human you. So they're good, but they're not leading to this liberation in how we view other species, which I argue for.
Sure. So then after the chapter where you talk about the incompatibility of the major religions text, then you talk about famous atheist responses to animal rights, two that people always champion as like their heroes in the atheist community, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and you talk about their views. You want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I do, because I knew what the first chapter was going to be, and in a sense I thought the whole book was just going to be a rant against religion, but it really turned into something different and I think extremely important. When I began to read to focus my research, I reread the works of the new atheists, so especially Dawkins and Sam Harris, but also Christopher Hitchens, and looked at what they had to say about animals, and especially Dawkins and Harris. What I found was, were these really amazing arguments for why we should acknowledge our own speciesism, which is valuing human species over others, why a vegetarian or vegan diet is more moral and more ethical. Albeit in a footnote, Sam Harris even says, from one perspective, we have to admit that factory farms are ethically indefensible. He says this, and I think he actually was vegan at its time, but then for health reasons, he started
because
eating
he couldn't exist.
Yes, because he was becoming a hologram like I am. And he's making these wonderful arguments, but for example, after saying this, he almost, in kind of like not even in some manner, he says, but it's okay to do because humans are not necessarily the apex of life on Earth, and someday we could become a food source for greater beings. Therefore, I will eat animals. He doesn't put in those terms, I will. But therefore, because we could become a food source for super beings, which is his term, and then he just pushes it aside. And I'm like, that's kind of, to me, that sounded like a cop-out. Yeah. More so than, and this is someone who's all based in reason. But when it comes to that, I thought the argument fell apart. Richard Dawkins has been very direct in his interviews with the uncut interviews on YouTube, where he interviews Peter Singer, and he tells Singer, you are a more moral person than me because you don't eat animals. So he's acknowledging it. Singer very, I think correctly says it's vestiges of religious belief that keeps you from not only acknowledging your speciesism, which Dawkins has, but actually acting on it. And as Singer notes in Animal Liberation, they come from a long tradition of philosophers, let's say in the 18th and 19th century, when they first began to consider animals, to really look at them as beings other than like a means to human ends. They would, with some exceptions, they would never follow through on their own ethical conclusions. And what I saw was that we have this new group, not that all of those philosophers were atheists, but a new set of philosophers, or social critics even, who are coming to conclusions, but they stop short of taking action.
Does Dawkins give any rationales to why he stopped short?
He does, and again, I thought they were reminiscent of Harris's in that they weren't sufficient. One example he gives is it would be too difficult because meat eating is so normalized, and I really just found that hard to believe that one of the most vocal, some would say even arrogant at times, critics of religion would feel a social stigma if he stopped. I can't imagine he would really think that. And I found out.
Is he worried he would suddenly start getting hate mail?
Yeah, I'm sure he would. And what I found out is just kind of a little backstory. It's all innuendo, but that he is kind of pressured by certain factions, like Peter Singer, to take that next step, because he has been vocal against speciesism in, again, very eloquent, powerful ways. I mean, I've always said, if he was on our side, it can open up opportunities for people to look at animals differently, but he does not make that step.
So let's talk about, I'm going to skip this one letter that I have here and move on to this next point. Let's talk about some of the arguments that people will say or offer in defense of their meat eating that aren't having to do with religion. Like, we already know that some people will say, okay, I can eat it because God provided them for me. Like, after the flood, he said, eat the meat. This is maybe something that a Jew might say or something. Okay, so what about the circle of life argument? It's pretty much seems a free of religion argument to me, but maybe people will say we've evolved to eat meat. Our ancestors did for millennia.
Right, and I agree with that, and I'm not, what I say is I don't argue for moral truths or absolutes, and what I look at is who is my audience, and I could be wrong, but I feel like anyone who has the financial means to even be thinking about animal liberation and atheism has the ability to make other choices. So there was a time when certain things were necessary for survival, but they become unnecessary as we progress. There's a wonderful quote, one of my favorite religious perspectives on animal rights is Matthew Scully's Dominion, and he says, some things were once necessary evils: wearing fur, slaughtering animals for food, taking milk, let's say, from their young, and things of that. He's like, and when you take out the necessary, they just become evil. And that is what I like to say to people. If you can make another choice that doesn't cause this, then I think the appeal to tradition, there's so many things in human history that we could call on and say, well, we've always done this. And some of those have become very shameful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sure.
Yeah, mm-hmm. And I think if you are lucky enough to be able to make choices, then do so. I'm not presumptuous or ignorant enough to think everyone can go vegan. Everyone can make that choice. Some people live in it's rare and rare as we become more industrialized globally, but some people still live in hunter-gatherer type of situation where it's a much different experience. I would never go to Papua New Guinea and start giving out vegan pamphlets. Yeah. So.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of covered my next point is dietary needs, especially in countries where nutrition is subpar. Obviously, Dawkins doesn't have a footing here because he's a wealthy person in a very advanced nation.
Yeah.
But for other people who maybe are not as wealthy, or like you gave an example, maybe live in a country that isn't known for its as great of agricultural diet or dietary.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I don't make that argument that it's always wrong in every case.
So what about having a continuum? Like obviously in your book, you're advocating for total animal liberation, animal rights. There's, you already mentioned, I guess, continuums under the religious umbrellas. But what about the person who just says, I just decided I'm not going to eat meat during the week, or I'm just going to be vegetarian, not vegan? Like, how do you feel about that? Or are we progressing the right way in that way, or are people still stopping short? Are they lying to themselves?
All of the above.
Okay, all right.
No, I do think it's good because it's acknowledging the other, which has been ignored for so many since only until recently have we begun to see that animals exist for their own purposes. So I think it is always a step in the right direction when somebody's thinking about it and they are choosing to not eat meat at certain times. I'm very critical of the humane farming movement or locavorism.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because I find that I find the idea of humane slaughter to be an oxymoron. So, I like, it's such a weird reaction I have when people tell me, I like that they're caring enough, but people who can, again, afford to say, I'm only going to eat locally and artisanal meat can easily afford to go vegan.
Sure. What about the overarching, this is a redundant phrase, I guess, the overarching hegemony of meat eating? Like maybe it's hard to maybe go out to lunch with your coworkers or even have people over, and it's relatively easy, I would think, to exclude meat, but all animal products is another level of difficulty.
Yeah, and I've been vegan for about 6 years, so I could easily say, oh, it's easy, I do it every day.
Sure, yeah.
But the truth is, I began to care about these issues 20 years ago, and I only went vegan 6 years ago.
Okay.
So I understand that, and part of it was, honestly, living in a city where most of my social acquaintances are vegan, it's very easy. But if you don't have this support group, it can be difficult. You want to be able to socialize, to eat the bread, and not wonder, is there milk or egg in this? But what I think would surprise people is, like I was at a conference once, and I had a very vegan hostile scholar say, I don't eat vegan food. And I'm like, you've never eaten fruit or vegetables or pasta? There are actually, I think people sometimes do eat vegan and they don't realize.
Oh yeah.
It's where it becomes difficult is like with, if you live in a more rural area, but it's still possible.
After reading your book, you start noticing it more. Kind of like when I left religion, I start noticing its influence more than I did before, because once you're out of it. So one thing that you mentioned, we're running low on time, but I want to talk about one thing. Is you mentioned suicide food.
Yes.
And especially in the city where I work, I think every restaurant that exists in the United States, there's at least one of them in that city. So you see them driving up and down the streets. But do you just want to, in 60 seconds, explain what suicide food is?
Yeah, sure. And then I hope people will begin looking for these examples. It's any image that, images to sell animal products that show the animals being consumed, offering themselves up to humans or primping for humans. One of the most, probably the common example would be Subway. And I thought it was just so weird, so I included mention of suicide foods in the book, where they have a pig saying, you know, put bacon on your sandwich, and then saying how it's like only this much money or something like that. And I'm like, now let's really think about this. It's a pig saying, you know, either slaughter and eat me or my friends or something like that. And and I'm glad that it kind of changed your perception where you see this a lot. And it's very often pigs. But even just driving on the highway, there's a billboard with a cow just so proud to produce milk for Kemp's.
Oh, right, not for its calf.
Yeah, and the life of dairy cows are, abysmal. So, this is this idea.
Yeah, you're right, billboards too. I was thinking just restaurant storefronts. But
like I'm so happy to be doing this for humans.
Here's a trident with pieces of meat on it.
Oh, yeah.
So your book is, I keep getting the title, Animal Liberation and Atheism. So do you want to just mention real quick where it's available, where people can get it to read more about this topic?
Absolutely. It's available at Freethought House. This is all online. Freethought House is the publisher of the book. And you can also get it on barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com.
Okay, that was really quick. So I read the whole book, as you know already, and I really enjoyed it. My wife and I, we were already vegetarians, but we're trying to go vegan more. So, and she hasn't read your book yet. Okay, a good resource.
Wonderful.
She hasn't read your book yet, but so we're trying to go more that way. And I've noticed other people in the atheist community. I think partly because of what you've drawn to their attention. So thank you.
I have had a few people tell me that, and it made me feel like this is what I want to do. Yeah,
I think especially having left religion, there was already awkward feelings in my head back then. You know, like I don't really want to do it, and then eventually you realize I'm just making up excuses, which I think you even cover in this book, which is like those gotcha questions.
Yeah, I try to cover all the bases.
So it was, to me at least, it was kind of the same thing. I don't want to speak for everyone, but so thank you
you
so much for the book, and then for coming on the show and talking about it. So
it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And if you would like to learn more about Minnesota Atheists, please contact us at the website and phone number, address that we have on the screen. We'll be happy to send you a free copy of our most recent newsletter, The Minnesota Atheists. And if you have ideas that you'd like to see presented on this show or talked about in our newsletter, let us know, because if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thank you for listening.